Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news and events that are going on in your world. My name is Bonnie Bright, and I'm the host of Depth Insights, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is a place for everyone who's interested in Jungian and depth psychology to discover, dialogue, and deepen into soul in all topics of depth psychology. And I'm here today with Susan Rowland. Hi, Susan.
Hi.
Great to have you here. Thanks for being with me.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, let me tell everybody just a little bit about you, Susan, and then we can just jump right in. Susan Rowland is the chair of MA Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life at Pacifica Graduate Institute in California, and formerly professor of English and Jungian Studies at the University of Greenwich. She's the author of a number of books on literary theory, gender, and Jung, including Jung as a Writer, Jung, a Feminist Revision, C.G. Jung in the Humanities, and the Eco-Critical Psyche, Literature, Evolutionary Complexity, and Jung. She also researches detective fiction, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, which is her new project and her book, The Sleuth and the Goddess, Hestia, Artemis, Athena, and Aphrodite in Women's Detective Fiction. And this was published by Spring. And Susan is currently working on a project on Dionysus and is also exploring new discourses in the humanities and creativity and postgraduate education in her program. So Susan, I wondered if you would just start us off by talking a little bit about the book. It's such a unique book. It's called The Sleuth and the Goddess, which already had my interest because it's clearly related to detective fiction and novels, and I've always been a very avid reader. But the tagline is what's kind of interesting here: Hestia, Artemis, Athena, and Aphrodite in Women's Detective Fiction. So I don't know that there is another book that really exists just like this. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about what motivated you to write it.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Yes, let's see if I can unpick this. All my work has been interested in the feminine and in depth psychology. And I've always been a reader of mysteries, detective fiction. And then I recently moved to America. I've actually just become an American citizen.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. And I was kind of deliberately wanting to understand this culture. And so I was making a point of reading detective fiction by women to try and understand what it meant to be a woman in America, which is different from what I've experienced previously. And becoming aware that women writers in general have been undervalued. The feminine is something that we're kind of aware of that's really important, but, is still insufficiently really explored. And I started to see archetypal patterns emerging and being very influenced by the work of Jeanette Paris and Christine Downing in particular, and I dedicate this book to them. I started to see connections between what they were writing about in terms of goddesses and the books that I was reading, and realizing that no one had really done this, looked at sort of divine figures in detective fiction. That's not been done in literary studies. It's not been done in depth psychology. It's not been done in cultural studies. So here was a project that would be part of me becoming this different person in America, and also that would contribute to our field.
I think it's really exciting because, as you say, it's such a brand new way to look at things. Your book suggests that the goddesses of the ancient world, which we've all probably heard these names, and particularly in the field of depth psychology. So we know a little bit who these amazing women goddesses are. But your book suggests, and what you're talking about suggests, that they actually inhabit or have a role somehow in detective fiction. So maybe you can talk about what that means for depth psychology. Your book, The Eco-Critical Psyche, has been a really important book to me, and I know that you have pursued a little bit what's going on in the natural world through literature. And so I sense somehow there's a connection because of the Great Goddess and, of course, all of Eric Neumann's work that he's done on it. So maybe talk a little bit about how all of those things come together for you, and specifically in the book.
Yes, exactly. I mean, one way of looking at this is very simple. We all know the word hermeneutics, meaning the study of texts, usually written texts, hermeneutics. And we're aware of the fact that in hermeneutics there is Hermes. And the trickiness of writing, the trickiness of language is in hermeneutics. Well, one of the things that's actually very present in Jungian psychology and very much developed by archetypal psychology is that there is never really one God. So there can't just be Hermes in hermeneutics, which means he's not the only God of writing. And, you know, just as we have a tradition that has been very kind of masculine focused, we need to start thinking about where are the feminine gods in writing? Because if they are in our psyche, as Jungian psychology, depth psychology suggests, then they're going to be in what our psyche does. So they're going to be in writing and they're going to be in reading. And, you know, these are not the only goddesses in detective fiction. These are not the only goddesses in culture. But I chose these goddesses because I felt that this particular genre, detective fiction, is deeply interested in what it means to be a hero. And it questions what it means to be a male hero. Detective fiction began about the same time as depth psychology. And culturally, I think, it's responding to some of the same kind of cultural pressures as depth psychology. It begins at the time of Freud. And, you know, there is an interest in early detective fiction in what it means to be a male hero. But also, from quite early on, there were women writers looking at what it means to be a woman in modernity and what it might mean to be a woman hero. And these goddesses are returning through women-authored mysteries, because the mysteries are mysteries. You know, it's both words are the same word here. That's the kind of main argument of the book, is that the mysteries that are detective fictions are also mysteries in the ancient sense of things like the Dionysian mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries. And that, you know, this is true for all detective fiction. I think it's true for anywhere in culture where the imagination is cultivated. But I'm looking at a section that has been neglected, relatively neglected women writers, and relatively neglected the feminine and what the feminine means. And it's not a feminine, of course, restricted to women. I say in the book, I've chosen to look at women writers because they've been neglected, but male writers will write of and from the feminine, just as women writers will write of and from the masculine. In fact, a few of the characters that I look at in the book are male characters, but they are exhibiting feminine archetypes. So there's a really engaging character by a British mystery author called Lindsay Davis, and her detective is a man called Falco, and he's very unlike your typical Sherlock Holmes detective because he takes his girlfriend and his babies and his best friend and the dog and their children. It's a very differently oriented sort of detecting. Now, let's not leave out nature here, because one of the great things about the Greek pantheon, and again, we don't have to use the ancient Greek goddesses and gods now, today, but there are reasons why we might want to do so. They've certainly culturally influenced the Western world. But these goddesses and gods do not have the Christian paradigm of separating the psyche from nature. So Artemis, for example, is a goddess of both nature and human nature. Aphrodite also, this is a point that is made very strongly by Christine Downing, that she is about the sexuality in the animal world and the sexuality in the human world. So another thing that's happening is that there are areas in culture that are opening up the psyche to participate in nature mysteries. And the feminine isn't the only place where it's happening, but it's a very important place where it's happening.
Mm-hmm. I like what you were referring to as the mysteries and the mysteries. I think that's a really, not just clever, but it also feels very true to me. And it's a really fascinating way to begin to look at, I mean, my version of depth psychology is that it is obviously the unknown, the unconscious. It's the study of the unknown or the unconscious. And so in all of our individuation processes, we are trying to resolve that mystery or at least shed some light on it to some extent. And so this idea that both mystery fiction of this genre started around the same time as depth psychology is really fascinating, because I look around today and I see that some things that are happening in our culture and in our world are definitely manifestations of more of a depth psychological trend or something that's happening, or at least that can be interpreted from a depth psychological standpoint. But can you just talk a little bit about specifically the goddesses and maybe give us an example of how they're appearing? Because you mentioned in the book that the goddesses are ways of knowing. And I like that too, because as we start to look at revealing these mysteries and finding out, kind of the whodunit aspect of this and what's behind the action that's going on in the books, how do the goddesses actually manifest? I mean, for example, Hestia, which we know is often as the goddess of hearth and home, how is she showing up in the streets in these kind of detective murder mysteries?
Yeah, it is fascinating. I mean, the start of the detective fiction genre and depth psychology, they're linked because both activities are about recognizing a problem about knowledge. Depth psychology recognizes there's a problem because there is so much of the psyche that is not being processed or acknowledged in the modern world, and that makes people sick. And detective fiction, we tend to think of it as we get to know everything, but actually in no detective story do you ever get to know everything. What you get to know is you get to feel the problem of knowing. And the different gods and goddesses offer us different ways of knowing. Now, Hestia's an unlikely goddess for a detective and for a detective story, but she's very present in women-authored mysteries. Mysteries today are generally divided into two categories, the cozy and the hard-boiled. And these tend to be gendered, and I don't need to say which goes with which. But cozy mysteries are, as that sounds, they tend to be very reassuring, they tend to be very artificial, they don't deal with the realities of violence, and they're often settled around homes or good, nice places. And they offer a kind of cozy reassurance. Now, that can be, and often is, very acutely Hestian, where the hearth becomes a means of knowing. You know through your familial skills, you know through your homemaking skills, you know through your feeling at home in a community. That gives you a way of knowing that community, which in fact can be vital in terms of finding out what's really going on, but it's not the kind of knowing that the police are encouraged to do. One of my favourite authors of this type of very Hestian influenced mystery is Diane Mott Davidson, and she's one of the kind of subgroup of cooking sleuths. There are a whole group of mysteries that centre around a woman who is some kind of cook, usually a professional cook, and she comes across all these dead bodies and things. There's usually a lot of humour in these mysteries, and that is something that I'm really interested in. There's a lot of humour in Jung, which tends to be overlooked and undervalued. And comedy is a very, very fundamentally divine form. We know that it's kind of Dionysus inspired, and it's a way of being alive that is very important, and it can be a way of knowing. So in a lovely mystery by Diane Mott Davidson called The Main Corpse, and they're all puns on food, this really engaging woman who's got a family and a teenage son and whatever, she actually goes on an armed heist to save her best friend who is being framed for murder. And the only way she can save her, she needs to get her out of the police custody. So she gets a friend to basically get some guns, and she does what you would imagine a kind of a heroic male would do in terms of rescuing his best friend. But she is this housewife who has to take her teenage son along with this kind of armed robbery type thing, because he won't let her take her dog, and she needs the dog because she needs the dog to act as a bloodhound. And the dog has been traumatized, so the son insists on coming with her as she uses a gun to try and rescue a friend from a prison van. So it's an extraordinary and comic situation. And the energy is Hestian. The energy is about protecting the hearth, protecting sometimes the stranger at the hearth, and sometimes it's the family that has to be protected by this woman becoming a heroic Hestia, and that's what she does.
That's great. I love the whole part about the humor and comedy as a way of knowing. I think that's really brilliant. You piqued my curiosity, though, when you said that there's a lot of humor in Jung. Do you have an example that you can give? I'd love to know what you're thinking about.
Well, the funniest piece he wrote is his analysis of James Joyce's novel Ulysses, and it's not a very well-known piece. It takes literary people to kind of find it, but he's reading this very difficult novel, and he keeps falling asleep. And he says, I fell asleep twice on the way to page 375, and it's just terrible. I can't bear this book. And it's very funny. And what I think is important in Jung is that the humour is a means of knowing, because it's a way of engaging and processing the material. And he then takes this kind of comic incapacity to read a difficult book, becomes part of a somatic resistance to the reading, and then he starts to do an active imagination on this resistance to the reading, and that leads him to some amazingly cultural insights. I also think that, he makes a few silly remarks about women, and it's not an excuse that they're comic when we read them today, but that comedy, I think, is part of how we can deal with his problems, shall we say.
Right, yeah, yes, it's a really good tool, I think, for us to be able to use to grasp what he was getting at. Yeah. And yet, it's interesting, Susan, because you are really primarily known for your work on Jung's work and for kind of being a Jungian, I guess we can say. But really, this book is focused primarily on archetypal psychology. What is the reason for that? Well,
that's a very good question. I mean, I think one is that I have been very deeply influenced by the work of Jeanette Paris and Christine Downing, and that was very much in the forefront of my mind. And as we've just been saying, Jung is not the best place to go for the feminine and the feminine in the divine, so it's a relief to find it elsewhere. Also, there is a kind of deeper answer to this, and that is what interests me about Jung is more his incipient polytheism than his monotheism. Now, he's clearly very interested in Christianity and the self and all the rest of it, but there is a kind of intrinsic polytheism there, and my work has tended to pull that out and argue that he's intrinsically post-structuralist and proto-polytheistic. And then, archetypal psychology is where it really happens like that. And so for this particular project, looking at women writers and looking at a diversity of hero styles, the women-authored archetypal psychology seemed to be the best place to go. I also draw quite explicitly and regularly on the work of James Hillman in the book. But it's the work of Paris and Downing which really kind of fires up this connection. I think that one could find these goddesses in Jung, but you'd have to look very, very hard.
Yes, I understand what you're saying, and I think most of our listeners will as well. So you've given us a really interesting example and fun example of where Hestia might in detective fiction, and I'm still laughing about the main corpse. That's great. Can you give us another example maybe of one of the other goddesses? In fact, it'd be really nice because it makes it so concrete if we could just talk about each one of the others in turn and share a story that works with them.
Yeah. Well, Athena It's really interesting because for those of us who feel the feminine has been undervalued and that patriarchy is a problem, Athena isn't the most popular goddess. She's known as the father's daughter, and in the Aeschylus play she finds for the father against the mother right when Orestes is being tortured for having killed his mother in revenge for his father. So she's kind of known as the patriarchal goddess. And so I wasn't even sure if I wanted to look for her, but archetypal psychology came to the rescue, really. And I realized through Hillman and the other figures that Athena is the goddess of the community, of what makes the community possible. And this is very profoundly important. And in a way, that the whole point of detective fiction is that murder makes a community impossible. You cannot have a community if murder isn't solved. Maybe you don't have to actually punish the wrongdoer in certain circumstances, but you cannot let it go and still have a community. And there's something very profound there, which I think goes to Athena. And then a friend of mine gave a wonderful conference paper on Athena and pointed out that in the play The Eumenides, she makes a place for the Furies within culture. And that's hugely important. And that this is also what is happening in mysteries, that we make a place for the Furies. If murder goes unsolved, then the Furies are unleashed and communities cannot survive. So there is this necessity to kind of deal with the Furies, which is really the kind of human savagery that is beyond all bounds. Now, there's a great series of books by a wonderful writer called Barbara Hambly, who sets her mysteries in 1830s New Orleans amongst the free coloured community. And these are people living on the margins because they're in a time of slavery. They are ex-slaves or the children of freed slaves. They are black or of mixed descent, and they are subject to being kidnapped and made slaves again. They have a very marginal life. And the Benjamin January novels I really love, and they're wonderful historical research. And there's one called Dead Water, in which the black protagonist, the detective, loses all his money because the bank goes under and is commissioned to try and find out what's happened to it. And he has to find out because without the money they will lose everything and possibly even end up as slaves again. And then there is a murder of the culprit and he's liable to be framed for it. And it's wonderful because there is another figure in the story, a black voodoo queen who is completely beyond reason. Athena is a woman's reason, a woman taking on the resources of reason. And this voodoo queen is just cursing and she's pure chaos. But through the novel, and because the detective ends up helping her granddaughter, she is the Furies who is brought back into the community. And it's very, very moving. And I recommend her books very strongly indeed. These are not funny books. They are very human, very humane books in which someone like this black detective has to have reason because he's in a rather insane culture with the kind of insanities of slavery are amazingly well portrayed in her works.
This sounds absolutely fascinating. You make me want to read it, which is a good sign, I guess. And you know what I'm thinking as you're talking about that too is this idea of the goddess as the great connector. That I think it was Norman who said maybe her greatest role of all is to be that great connector. And of course, she also is overseeing these cycles of life, the whole death and rebirth kind of things, which we do see typically in literature and particularly in detective fiction.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, for example, we haven't looked at Artemis or Aphrodite yet, and they're both very much focused on what you just said about the cycles of life and death. Artemis is the bringer of death, And there is a strong element of Artemis in these women-authored mysteries. You'd kind of expect that because she's the hunter, and so it's the woman as hunter, and she's so autonomous, so she's the woman who won't be corralled by patriarchy, who won't be tied down, who won't be limited by male institutions like the police. She's also a woman who's in touch with nature, who part of her is in nature. And there's some wonderful mysteries in which, you know, these are ecological mysteries in a way where, for example, in an author like Nevada Barr, her detective is a national park ranger. And she goes to different national parks and she's in the wilderness and she's of the wilderness. And that's where the mysteries take place. And I think a truly amazing book is Nevada Barr's Winter Study, where the ranger goes along with a group of scientists who are studying wolves in the Isle Royale National Park in winter. Now, this is actually a real study. And so the author did real research and looked at this ranger alongside these actual scientists doing those scientific work with wolves. And the whole book is a kind of a problematizing of knowing that scientific research with animals in the wild, however loving it is, and it's clear that these scientists she portrays love the wolves and care for them deeply and are even prepared to break the law to look to save them, there's something missing. There's some kind of embodied, intuitive, imaginative connection that is missing, that the ranger, through her kind of Artemis figure, achieves. Artemis is also the protector of women or young women. She protects women in childbirth. In this particular book, the main bad guy, if you like, is a rapist, a serial rapist. And so again, we have this kind of Artemis who's ultimately prepared to bring death if it's the only way to protect future women. And that's part of what happens. Aphrodite, of course, is associated with the erotic. And the erotic is very present in mystery fiction. Eros and sexuality can be a way of knowing, and you often get a woman detective who maybe has a romance or uses her sense of sexuality, her eros, as part of her way of knowing, of getting to understand a situation. Aphrodite is also the goddess of the pleasures of the body, and I think there's something about the way mysteries have murder is always an unnatural death, and it's an offence to the goddess. And so I think a lot of what happens around the dead body is the sense of the sacred, which is there in mystery fiction, in the rituals surrounding a body and how it's treated. And the dead body becomes a knowing body because it becomes a source of clues.
Wow, that's really profound, actually. So this is interesting because the two words that you just brought up are very much, for me, depth psychology words, and that is both the sacred and ritual. So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how those come into detective fiction. Well, I think we can start with the fact that those of us who love detective fiction really love it, and we read it. We want to read more detective fictions, and we just go on and read and read and read. And this sense of wanting to repeat something that we already know about. We know that, there are rules in detective fiction. There are things that we expect as we pick up a mystery that we get. We get them unexpectedly, but we get them. We get a dead body and we get so on and so forth. So there is a strong kind of ritual element in the writing and reading of mysteries. They are a place of ritual in our culture. And in terms of the sacred, I think, again, this is what rituals do, isn't it? They allow the sacred to be embodied. And so in our reading, in the writing and reading of mysteries, the sacred is embodied, enacted. The goddesses return through their writing. The hermeneutics gives way to a kind of the four goddesses inhabiting the writing.
and that sacred being enacted in our reading of these ritual spaces.
I think this is just so creative, Susan. I really am so excited about what you've done here with this book, and I wish we could go on. I'm just absolutely fascinated. We are running to the end of our time, so I just wanted to sort of wrap this up by asking you, I guess, one more time, and maybe you feel like you've already said that, but it just seems like such a nice place to revisit this whole idea about ritual and ritual creating the sacred and the reading and writing up. It makes me feel like I should be reading more of these. But what it is it's about consciousness, and it's about creating that understanding and bringing attention to the fact that anything that we do can be a depth psychological process if we bring that consciousness to it. And so I just wanted to congratulate you, first of all, for bringing this book out, and ask if you would just then sort of restate maybe one more time how you feel that depth psychology and detective fiction comes together.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that one of the reasons I wrote the book is that, you know, this is a project that is not mine, it belongs to all of us. And there is so much potential in bringing a depth psychology, polytheistic lens to all kinds of culture. You know, I've just done a tiny bit of a particular genre. There is all of the other literary genres, and there are films, and, you know, exactly, there's just huge potential here. So there is something specific I'm arguing about detective fiction and depth psychology, that they do both begin at the same time in history, around about the mid-19th century. Interestingly, detective fiction begins in America. Really, the first detective writer was Edgar Allan Poe. And of course, he's a writer who has been a great interest to depth psychology for a long time, with Lacan's particular interest in one of his stories. So what's new about detective fiction is this figure is the detective. There's been crime fiction for centuries, going back to the ancient Greeks, but detective fiction is new. And it's this figure who knows that knowledge is a problem, like the psychoanalyst, this figure that needs to find clues, needs to identify clues and track the clues to something that cannot be known fully, the mystery of life and death. But there is an urgent cultural need to become this figure who will search for clues to the bigger mysteries of the psyche.
That's beautiful. I love that. That's such a great analogy, and also a really good reminder for all of us. Susan, as we wrap up, I just want to read really quickly, because I was looking earlier at the testimonials that are on the back of the book here. And there's this one by Dr. Luke Hockley, who's a psychotherapist, and he's also a Jungian film theorist. And I just wanted to read what he wrote about this book, because I thought it was so compelling. He said, about The Sleuth and the Goddess, detective fiction is compelling. Once started, it has to be finished. The Sleuth and the Goddess is no less gripping. In this riveting book, Susan Rowland is part detective, part analyst, and always a brilliant literary critic. She adroitly reveals how detection is one of the central myths of the modern psyche. The crime scenes she investigates reveal their psychological and literary clues to show how the reemergence of the sacred feminine is at the center of women's mystery detective stories. Never cozy, never hard-boiled. This is cultural psychology at its very best. I thought that was beautiful, and it really sums up exactly what you shared with us. Susan, I hope that at some point you will be willing to host a book club on Depth Psychology Alliance and be able to engage readers in both a written forum and maybe online as well. And we can talk about that at another time, but I just really think that this is such a valuable book. I wanted to let everybody know that you can find out more about Susan. She is on Facebook, so you can find her under susan.rowland.161. And you can also find her, a lot of her writings actually, on the academia.edu site for people who know that. So just go there and look for Susan Rowland.
And I'd like to say that there is a free chapter of this book on that site.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, great. So everybody can look for that. And Susan, will your students be able to have this book as one of their textbooks at some point, or can you just say more about what they're learning and discovering in your program at Pacifica?
Well, I actually teach on 2 programs, as well as I chair the MA Engaged Humanities. And in fact, 2 students from the MA Engaged Humanities, 2 alumni, designed the cover of the book. I want to thank Karen Fogelson and Lisa Pounders for the cover design. And yeah, the book very much speaks to the kinds of things that we do in that program. I also teach on the Jungian and Archetypal Studies doctoral program, where this book, before it was published, some chapters were used as set text because I have a course there on post-Jungian cultural criticism. So, I tend to sort of be thinking of my students when I write a book, and this was kind of designed as a how-to, how to use archetypal psychology in a very kind of precise and focused way to generate cultural criticism. So it's been used on that course, and you never know, it might come into others.
Very good. Well, I can highly recommend all of your books. I just think that you're an excellent writer, Susan, and I'm so grateful for you sharing your gift with all of us, and I'm wishing you the best of luck with the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and best of luck with this wonderful enterprise of the Depth Psychology Alliance. We're very grateful to you.